this video, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about types. And in JavaScript, like any other language, the types kind of make up the building block of the language. And in your JavaScript programs, you're going to be manipulating a lot of values, and it's going to be good to know what type of thing those values are. Because we're going to want to know, is something a string? Is something a number? Is something an object, for example? So it's worthwhile to kind of take a second to examine those different types and see what we can do with them. The first type I'm going to go over is number, and number is quite straightforward in JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't really differentiate between things like floats or integers. Everything is just kind of treated as a number. And if we want to see that, we can console.log out any number, really. So this is just a representation of the number 10. If you want to verify the type of thing it is, you can always just use this keyword type of, followed by the thing you want to check. Right, so if I run this, I'll clear the console, run it again. So I didn't quite catch, let me hit save and try to run it again. Right, so it tells us that this is a number. Right, so if you're ever not sure what something is, this will help clear it up. To contrast this with what a string looks like, this is a string, and this will tell us, hey, this is a string. Right, so this can be important to know if you're trying to do something like simple arithmetic on your numbers, which is definitely possible. So here, if I want to console log 10 plus 6, for example, that's easily doable. We just treat it like a number. Pretty much all the basic arithmetic is possible, division, multiplication, etc. You can do this modulus operator as well, which if you've never seen before, will basically return to you what the remainder would be if 10 was divided by 6. Let's see, the remainder would be 4 in that case. If it perfectly divides, so we know that 10 is perfectly divisible by 5, doesn't leave any remainder, so that will result in 0. Right? And then if we want to see multiplication, of course, it's very simple. There is also a built-in math object that we can use. So we start with a capital M, and if we want to see, for example, a random number, math.random, let's see what this gives us. We run it, and it gives us a random number between 0 and 1. So we can see it's 0.6 something something something. We can call, for example, math.pi if you want to get just pi, for example. Right? And you can use this if you're trying to calculate the radius or the circumference of a circle, for example. You know that you don't have to input pi manually. There is a built-in math object, and we can call certain methods on that object. Now, if you do have a string, for example, which we will get to, but a string is basically a primitive that looks like this. For example, this is a string. If you have a number representation of a string, like so, well, we've already seen that this type of is actually a string. Right, so let me clear that and run it again. So that means if you're trying to do something like arithmetic and add a string representation of 10 to a number representation of, say, 213, let's see what happens if we try to do this. We'll run it, and not exactly the behavior we expect. Right? So what it's doing is JavaScript is seeing, well, I have a string over here, and over here I have a number. Oh, this person probably wants to concatenate this string. They probably want me to convert this number into a string and then add it to the original string. And that's usually not what you want to do if you're trying to add numbers together like this. Right, so a bit of unexpected behavior. We can use a built-in function called parseInt, like so. And parseInt takes in a string, and it parses it, turns it into a number. So now if we try to run this again, we'll see that it does do the addition correctly. Right, so you use parseInt if you need to convert something from a string into a number. Now parseInt does also take a second optional argument. So if you use comma here and I put in a 10, basically I'm telling it to take this string, parse it into a number based on base 10, which it kind of does automatically by default. If you do want to be explicit though, you can say, hey, always do base 10 for this number. If you wanted to see, if you were taking in some kind of binary number for some reason, if this was your binary number and you wanted to see that represented as an integer, you could say, hey, this is base 2. Right? And we'll see that, okay, 1 and 0 represents 2 in terms of binary, but pretty rare to have to do that. So generally you're okay to just not give the second argument to parse int and you'll be good to go. What if you give it something that can't be coerced into a number, like hello? Let's see what it does. And we get NaN, which stands for not a number. So this will kind of pop up if you're trying to coerce something that's not a number, right? Usually pretty obvious, but not always. So let's put this back the way it was. And let's see another way we can check if something is a number. So we can console log. Oh, something went wrong while saving your most recent work. Okay, not going to worry about that. We can console log, and we can do a check here. Is not a number, is nan, and you pass it something that may or may not be a number. In this case, if we pass it a string that says hello, this is actually going to return true because it's checking, is this thing not a number? Right, so let's see what happens. So it's true, this is not a number. Otherwise, if it is a number, let's see, is nan? False, right? This is a number, that's why is nan is returning as false. And by the way, instead of parse int, a different way to do this is you could use what's called the unary plus operator, like this, and it's just kind of a quicker way to convert something from a string to a number. So if we check that out, we can see that it has been converted into a number. So this plus, if you ever see this plus and then a string afterwards and you're not sure what it's doing, it's essentially just converting a string into a number for you. That about covers it for numbers. Not much more to say, so I'm going to comment these out and move on to the next topic, which is, we've kind of discussed it here and there, strings. And strings in JavaScript are sequences of Unicode characters. And I believe Unicode is capitalized. And as I'm sure you've noticed by now, strings are basically wrapped in quotation marks. So if you want to console log out a string, you can use single quotes or double quotes. JavaScript does treat them interchangeably. Personally, I tend to use double quotes, but you might see the occasional single quote slip in here and there. Right, so oops, looks like it didn't quite catch the most recent code. We'll run that again. Still didn't catch it. Let's try saving it again and running it. Okay, there we go. So this is our string. You can see it is still wrapped in the quotation marks. And this is all we need for a representation of the word hello. Right? Doesn't have to be a word, of course. It can be any representation you want. This is a string representing the character H. And of course, like most of these other types, if you're coming to JavaScript from another programming language, you will be familiar with strings already. And you know what? Let me add a bit of space here. Now, strings, they are pretty straightforward overall. You can kind of use strings like objects in a way. But basically, you can get something like, if you want to know the length of a string. So let's say we want to know the length of the word super duper. We can say console log super duper. Right, so we know what this will print out. And we can call dot length, which is a built-in method to be able to get the length of a string. If I clear it, run it again, length is 10 characters. Right? If we counted that out, I'm sure it would equal 10. Spaces do count as well. Let's run this again. We see that now we have an extra character in there. Right? In fact, there's a number of built-in methods we can use on strings. So if we had, for example, my name, Chris, and we wanted to get a certain character at a certain index in this string, well, we can say dot character, dot char, at what index we want to grab. So index 0, let's see what this gives us. Clear, run again. Okay, so because JavaScript, like many languages, uses 0-based index, this is actually position 0. This, or index I should say, this is index 0, this is index 1, and so forth. So just something to be aware of. If I wanted, for example, the character at index number 4, what would that be? Well, that's an S. Okay, pretty interesting stuff. Strings, you can add them as well, which is called concatenating. Let me add some space. So if you wanted to say console.log hello plus world plus an exclamation point. Right, this is going to concatenate these together. You might notice there won't be any spaces when we do that. Hello world. So we can add representation of spaces as well, like so, plus world. Right, notice that I'm adding these together using plus. And we'll add a space here as well. Don't forget your plus. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so hello world. Oh, you know what? We don't need that space there. Yeah, there we go. Another built-in method we can call is to convert everything to uppercase. And as you might imagine, that method is called toUppercase. So if I console log that out, I want to be uppercase dot to uppercase, like so. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Okay, I want to be uppercase. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy, pretty nice to be able to use these built-in methods on these strings. All right, so strings are pretty straightforward, just like numbers. Think of them as kind of primitive data types with some methods wrapped around them, like toUppercase, .character at, for example.